everyone. Welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and our guest today is Verandah Porche. Verandah is a poet who has found inventive ways to make poetry her livelihood. She's written and published books and essays. She's received honors, facilitates workshops and residencies, and she's also a VPR commentator. And she also collaborates with artists, musicians, farmers, and factory workers, which we will hear more about now. Welcome, Verandah.
Oh, hi, Wendy. It's great to be on.
That's nice to have you on. I'm going to start with a fun fact about Verandah right off the bat, which is a recent honor, actually. Verandah was asked to do the Devotional at the Vermont State Legislature this year. Mm-hmm. Then it was on Valentine's Day.
Yes, well, actually, I could have done it any time, but I picked Valentine's Day. Well, for one thing, I'm a widow, and I figured that nobody was going to be romancing me. And the other thing was that there's so much venom, so much fracturing, so much division in public life that I thought it was an opportunity to celebrate what we have in common and the common language that maybe nobody has ever heard, that I've been lucky enough to hear as an itinerant poet.
Yes, which is a great phrase. I love that description, because you have indeed traveled far and wide in the state of Vermont, and you maybe even a little bit farther
I've
afield.
traveled beyond that, but Vermont has been my beat for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get into doing that? And you call it told poetry.
Told poetry or shared narrative. I was working as a poet in residence in schools, and at Green Mountain High School, I had an exchange student in one of my classes, and she was making her home with a woman who was the activities director at the Gill Oddfellows home. And Wendy Regier is her name, and she invited me to come and do a poetry workshop in Ludlow at the home. And so I said yes, and I got to the home, and there were an amazing group of women who knew each other, largely farm women, who had been part of the female wing of a fraternal organization, oddly called the Oddfellows.
Right.
And when it was time for them to write, they all crossed their arms in front of them and said, "Oh, we have shaky hands, we have nothing to say." And so it was one of those expletive deleted earn your living poet. And I said, "Okay, you talk, I'll take it down." And that was the beginning of You Talk, I'll Take It Down.
That was the beginning of you becoming a scribe.
Becoming what I jokingly call the Terry Gross of the Great Unheard. I mean, she has famous people who had just broken through with some new fame.
Right.
And I look for the people who don't even know what they're going to say.
Yes, right. And the process itself is so fascinating, I would think, for you as well as for them, because you're really just in conversation with them. Is that pretty much how it works?
Yeah. I like to think of it as radical receptivity, of just following the train of somebody's thought, of finding what excites them and drawing that out. And then when there's that turn of phrase, turn as in verse, I say, well, maybe it's time to start writing. And so somebody will narrate, and I will interrupt them and ask them to slow down. It's a very artificial process. And to create a told poem, it might take 15 or 20 minutes to get the text down, and then we'll go over it and maybe heighten some details, maybe say, what's the truth goes marching on ending. And So that's one way that I work.
Yes, and that's almost curating, right? You're taking someone's spoken word and you're going back into it.
With them.
With them, yes.
Yes. It's definitely a shared power opportunity for both of us. And I like to joke that I'm part rabbi, part raptor, because everybody is longing to hear something that just blows their minds.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm also there to validate the wonder of each person's life, no matter how sorrowful it is. It has dignity and weight for me.
And it's their expression as well. And so
It's true.
Yeah, it's their expression that you're working with. There was a great quote of yours. You said, "My hands hoe their deeds, we put words by."
Oh, that's right. That was in one of my poems. But when I was working at the Veterans Home in Bennington, one of the old guys said, "You took my words into your hands and you wrote them down. You made that time and you took that effort." And he said, "Nobody's ever done that before, and maybe someday someone will find it." And I wish I were more famous for them, because sometimes I think in many of these projects I'm the primary beneficiary, because it takes place between each narrator and me. And some projects have gotten a fair amount of attention and airplay, but these are mostly underfunded projects where there might be a little book or something like that. So the grandeur of the exchange remains sort of in the great collective stream of unconsciousness.
Yes, which reverberates out to the whole universe, right?
I like to think that.
Yeah. And I think it does. I mean, I think even just going into a room with a group of people, I would think would be amazing. And to have them have the opportunity to tell their stories and then have your attention put on them. And so then creating something brand new, really.
Well, I really prefer to work with people one at a time. I have done a fair amount of work in groups, but I found even in that first nursing home that when the talk got really thick, that people wanted to have my undivided attention and some privacy.
Right. Yes. And I think, when I say a group, I mean, I know that you've gone into, it was factory workers in Newport, is that correct, the first one?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't the first project, but it was a wonderful one. And mostly I talked to people one at a time there, but we got to present our findings to groups of people. And often, especially in New Hampshire, people said, "I want to keep what's mine to me." There was a great desire for privacy. But sometimes when a person heard what she had said written down, that there was much more release, because it was exactly what she meant, and she had said what she meant, and there it is. I've trained a bunch of people to be inquiring scribes over time, and people will do it their own way. It's not like I have a trademark attached to it. People will develop a relationship, and the eloquence of the text from that point of view really doesn't matter. It's about just being together with nothing else in the way.
Right. And having someone listen to you.
Yes.
Yeah, that's such a big deal.
And want to know more.
Yeah.
Share that curiosity.
Yeah. One of your more recent projects is very local. You did the Broadbrook Anthology in Guilford.
Yes. Well, I started a hunting and gathering expedition, when there was a time of conflict in town, somebody had brought up zoning. And if there's one thing that makes the town of Guilford, Vermont go postal, it's any hint of zoning. There's a very strong libertarian feeling. And somebody said, Guilford is not a neighborhood anymore, it's just a collection of roads. And so I decided that I would go and interview the elders in this town, the people who made the place and who claimed it as their own. And so I interviewed 30 different elders. And then for Guilford's 250th anniversary, I created a play for voices, which were really prose poems, only their words, but their words subtracted, distilled, with a few of my words in between, maybe a poem or two, and some introductions. And then we had some of the most wonderful actors playing these elders. And also Don McLean, my brother-in-law, wrote music. We had live music. And Jeff Woodward had created a photo stream of archival photographs, current portraits, and wonderful invented antique photographs. And so we did that first for Guilford's semi-quincentennial, and then we did it for my 50th anniversary of living in Guilford in November. And that was just a triumphant experience.
Yes, and I was lucky enough to have seen that production, and it was so powerful, and it was so moving and interesting at the same time, and you had so many elements going on. And I think, you know, for you, being so connected to poetry and having that ear, bringing out into a script. I mean, it was scripted, but they were, you know, very much selects and very much quotes, you know, from the people. Everything worked together so well, and so these very, very homely, you know, in the best sense of the word, stories came forth, you know, from this in a very powerful way for the audience.
Well, it is a vanishing time that they were talking about, of women who at age 14 or 15 would begin a courtship that lasted a lifetime.
Right.
And that people had confidence that they knew who they were and they could feel out the lay of the life that was coming. And that was just, as we used to say, mind-blowing. and the friendships have been marvelous. And excerpts from their text have been a staple at their funerals.
Oh, right.
They get to give their own eulogy.
Oh, wow. Yes. If we could go back a minute, I love what you say about verse, the word verse.
Oh. Well, verse means turn, as in clap it into reverse. And in every great conversation, even if it's a conversation with oneself, there's this turn, you know, turn of phrase. And I was thinking, as a back to the lander, of my experiences with things turning, of making cheese. And so one moment it's warm milk with some culture in it and perhaps some rennet. And then there's a moment where it just separates into curds and whey, just like Little Miss Muffet. Same deal with butter. And same thing with thought, that there's a transformation. And I'm always interested in transformation.
Whether it's told poetry or you writing your own poetry or collaborating with artists and musicians, which we'll get to as well, that there's a certain kind of alchemy that occurs, right?
I think so.
And you come out with a whole other creation. When you started out, you still are doing a lot of traveling in the car. And I think you know where I'm going with this. As poems came to you, you couldn't write in the car.
It would be against the law practically. I tried. I do have notebooks with sort of sideways writing in it, but I did find, especially when I was driving up the interstate, that I could write songs. They weren't terribly tuneful songs, but the phrases were repeatable with a rudimentary melody. And so, just as the oral poets from before written language would probably use repetition and sort of borrowed phrases, that it helped to keep the process rolling with no script.
Well, I would think it would also be an easier way. You can always remember something easier if there's a tune to it, right?
Yes, it's a mnemonic device.
Yes, which we need.
Yes,
we need
yes.
more of in our lives.
Yeah.
This sort of brings us a little bit to collaboration, and you've collaborated. I'm thinking of the music.
Patty Carpenter, who I hope everybody knows, is a wonderful musician, singer, songwriter. And she's played with a whole bunch of different bands. Usually she's the center of the band. There's Patty and the Cakes. There's the Dysfunctional Family Jazz Band, who that consists of her ex, Scotty Shetler, and her daughter, Melissa, and sometimes her son, Travis Light. But Patty and I have been friends since our earliest Back to the Land days. She's younger than I am. But her daughter, Melissa, and my older daughter, Una, grew up together. They were in the first generation of the Packer Corners Kids Club, also including Eli Gould. And so Patty and I were often together, and we vowed that someday we would sit down and write a bunch of songs. And so for some reason, right around Hurricane Katrina, we both had some free time, and we wrote a whole bunch of songs. And those songs were recorded by the Dysfunctional Family Jazz Band. Melissa sang a lot of what would be my parts, because she sings way better than I do. I can be heard doing a spoken word riff on the CD, but it's called Come Over. And it's, well, I, of course, think it's wonderful. And so Patty and I have written at least 30 more songs since that era. We are famous in our own tiny sphere for emergency songwriting. You know, somebody has died, somebody has a birthday, somebody is having a celebration, and we will write a song.
EMT poetry, right?
That's EMT songs for the nonce.
And so, you know, I can see, you know, music being a really good fit. Painting is a little bit different.
Yeah, well, all of these projects are based in friendship. I think friendship was the genius of the counterculture, you know, privileging, you know, honoring friendship as a form of love that's perhaps even more durable than our passionate partnerships with Ms. X or Mr. or non-binary somebody. You know, our friendships are unbreakable mostly. And so so my friendship with Kathleen Kolb, the painter, started at the Governor's Institute on the Arts, where I worked for about 30 years, maybe 29, originating the program and the poetry program. And so I worked there for many years, both doing a straight-out poetry class, collaborating with our own Eugene Newman on a poetry and jazz class. Kathleen left the faculty and came back and showed her work, and among the things she did was a series of paintings of people working in the woods with all kinds of tools and machines. And I had the intense feeling that these paintings needed a voice. And so we spent 3 years probably fundraising.
Wow.
Kathleen's patrons were extremely generous, and my patrons were many, and gave what they could. And we got grants.
Oh, wow.
And so the upshot of that was an exhibition and a catalog called Shedding Light on the Working Forest. And Kathleen told all of these loggers and truckers and foresters that her friend Verandah the poet wanted to talk to them. And believe me, that's a buzzkill for a logger. But they loved the paintings of her.
Oh.
And so they were our ambassadors.
That's wonderful.
I just sat down in their kitchen or shop or someplace and said, what do we need to know in order to walk into this painting? And people leaned forward like this, or they sat back like that. A sure sign that someone is interested. And people were extremely generous with me.
That's so great.
And, my husband got taken sick during that project. Richard Coutant, he developed pancreatic cancer and was dead in 47 days. And so having this project where I had a counter narrative to attend to was really so steadying. And all of those people understood suffering. And there wasn't a lot of sentimentality, but there was a whole lot of, we get through it. And so that was just an generally untold backstory for that project.
Yes. You spoke a bit about Total Loss Farm, which many of us know about locally because that was 50 years ago, I believe, that you folks came up.
It's pushing 51, but 50 is a good number.
50 is a nice round number, and there's been quite a bit in the last few years. Peter Gould did a nice memoir about it, and other people. So can you just give us a little snapshot of Total Loss? How your poetry came out of there?
Okay. Well, I really wondered what it was going to be like to write poetry in the country because my poetry lived in cities, but we had the great need to relocate, to start over. And those stories have been told many times. And so we found the farm. A bunch of us who knew each other before, and people said, oh, you're starting a commune. And we didn't really know what a commune was. It was more like everybody bunks up when they're in college, and so what's the big deal? But we had just come from the riots in Washington, D.C., and creating a peaceable kingdom seemed like a critical project. And also, for me, finding a language that was timeless, really. And I remember getting there and trying to learn the names of everything, all of the names of the weeds and the trees. And I mean, I knew nothing. But everything seemed to have magical properties, and I wanted to know what they were. And so there was something called winter. And I had never known anything called winter. And winter meant that, we had retired early. To live on roots and berries, on these, what we thought was 100 acres, and we had a 10-year mortgage, and the mortgage was $227.10 a month. And there were maybe 10 of us to be able to forage that money, and sometimes it was hard. But I had winter, and that meant staring at the fire once I learned to make a fire, and plonking over the snow in snowshoes, reading long novels, and just studying my mind and the encounter with love and loss and the world. And so it was great.
You came from an urban area, and you came from Teaneck, New Jersey.
Oh, yes, Teaneck, New
Teaneck,
Jersey.
New Jersey.
I always loved words. And my father was really a silent type. In fact, my friend Mimi, who was married, who lived with Marty Jaser and knew his family, said, the father in the Jewish the father in the Jewish family is not a speaking part. And so one of the ways I had my father talk with me was during the crossword puzzle. And so every night at dinner, we did the Times crossword puzzle in ink. You know, in my book, there's a whole poem about doing the crossword puzzle. But I stopped doing the crossword puzzle some years later, but there was a whole period of time where after he died, it was channeling. You know, I just felt that he could send back what we had never seen, but that would, I love the idea of words falling into place.
Yes, right, and anagrams and acrostics and all of the different forms. And we didn't get into talking about the different forms and structures that you use in poetry. But I did think in terms of the crossword puzzle story, how you're always looking for the right word. You know, you were trained early to look for the right word. And I think some of the words that you come up with are always different than what you would expect, and therefore there's always a really nice surprise in your poems.
Well, that makes me so happy to hear.
It's true. It's my experience of your poems. Anyway. Before we close up shop today, it would be wonderful if you could read one of your poems and share it with our audience.
Okay. This is called Villanelle and April, and it's loosely based on the birth of my second daughter, Emily, who was born after a bumpy truck ride in mud season. And so here it is, Villanelle and April. One night, the beavers breached the dam and fled, leaving a rutted crater in their wake. Suddenly, her water floods the bed. "Come out and hear the woodcocks court," he said. "How curious the ruckus that they make." That night, the beavers breached the dam and fled. Two adolescent hawks wheel overhead. Later, she sees their figure eights in the dark as suddenly her water floods the bed. "We've had more rain than we anticipated." The weather hovered over tea and cake the night the beavers breached the dam and fled. "It's somewhere between a rock and a loaf of bread," she laughed. "But how much longer will it bake?" Afterwards, her water floods the bed. He sang the antiseptic scent of melted snow. The season opens like an egg. That night, the infant breached the dam and slid from her. The beavers slapped their tails and fled.
Wonderful. Welcome, April.
Yes.
Welcome,
yes,
Emily.
It will be.
Yes, that's right.
It shall be.
April
for both of our Emilys.
That's right. April is coming.
Yes.
Thank you, Veranda.
Oh, thank you so much.
It was lovely
what
to
a
have
pleasure.
You on. Yeah, thank you. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's wonderful having Veranda on and hearing some live poetry. Tune in again next week. We will be here.